When a group of rowdy bikers challenged Vance over his bold choice to wear a MAGA hat, no one could have predicted the powerful turn of events that would leave everyone speechless. The diner sat at the edge of a dusty stretch of highway outside Amarillo, Texas. It wasn't the kind of place you'd notice unless you were looking for it. Its neon sign, half flickering against the fading afternoon light, spelled out Mel's Diner in pink and blue, though one of the letters had long since burned out. Inside, the aroma of frying bacon mingled with the faint sweetness of maple syrup. The hum of conversation and the clinking of forks against plates created a comforting backdrop, a haven for weary travelers and locals alike. Vice President J.D. Vance pulled his government-issued SUV into the gravel lot, the engine rumbling softly before he turned it off. He was traveling without much fanfare, just his chief of staff and a small security detail in another vehicle. He preferred it that way when the schedule allowed. Today, he wanted to escape the noise of Washington and get a feel for the people he often spoke about in speeches but rarely got the chance to sit with. Stepping out of the car, J.D. adjusted the MAGA cap perched on his head. It wasn't meant as a political statement, though he knew how easily it could be taken that way. The hat had been a gift from a retired factory worker he'd met at a rally in Ohio. It was a symbol of pride and resilience, not a weapon of division. Still, he was aware of the loaded meaning it might carry in places like this. The diner's door creaked open as he entered, letting in a burst of warm air and the faint sound of an old jukebox playing George Strait in the background. Heads turned briefly, eyes flickering with a mix of recognition and curiosity. J.D. wasn't exactly trying to blend in, but his jeans, button-down shirt and well-worn boots helped soften the image of the polished politician. He chose a booth. In the corner, instinctively sitting with his back to the wall. Years of small-town life and later politics had ingrained in him a habit of observing before acting. A waitress approached, her weathered smile framed by tired eyes that hinted at long shifts and countless cups of coffee served. "What can I get you, hun?" she asked, pulling a notepad from her apron pocket. "Coffee and waffles, please," J.D. replied with a polite nod. "I hear they're the best around." She smirked, glancing at his hat. "Depends who you ask." Her tone wasn't unfriendly, but it carried a subtle edge. J.D. smiled faintly. "Well, I'll take my chances." As she walked away, J.D. leaned back in the booth, letting his eyes wander around the room. The diner was a patchwork of mismatched chairs, faded checkered tablecloths, and walls adorned with pictures of local landmarks and old-time celebrities. A group of older men played cards near the window, their voices low but animated. A young couple sat at the counter, sharing a milkshake and a plate of fries. The place had an air of familiarity, the kind of spot where stories were shared and gossip traveled faster than the coffee refills. J.D. let out a quiet sigh, his mind drifting to the speech he'd given earlier that morning at a nearby town hall. He had talked about unity, about bridging divides and reinvesting in forgotten communities, but speeches were easy. Moments like these, sitting in a diner with no agenda other than listening and learning, felt far more meaningful. The bell above. The door jingled, snapping him out of his thoughts. A group of 6 bikers strode in, their leather jackets creaking as they moved. They carried themselves with the kind of confidence that came from living on their own terms, their boots striking the floor with authority. Conversations quieted, replaced by the low hum of tension as the bikers claimed a table near the center of the room. J.D. watched them briefly, then returned his focus to his coffee as the waitress set it down in front of him. "Your waffles'll be out in a minute," she said, glancing at the bikers before leaning in slightly. "You let me know if you need anything, okay?" "Thank you," J.D. replied, sensing her unease. He took a sip of his coffee, savoring its simple bitterness. For now, the diner was calm, but there was a tension in the air, a quiet weight of unspoken words waiting to be said. J.D. had a feeling this afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn. The diner's peaceful hum grew heavier as the bikers settled into their seats. They weren't rowdy, at least not yet, but their presence was magnetic. Everyone else in the room seemed to unconsciously shrink, their conversations faltering into murmurs. The leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard and a leather jacket that read Iron Ridge MC, scanned the room. His nickname, Bull, was stitched onto a patch on his chest. Bull's eyes locked onto J.D., lingering on the cap atop his head. The MAGA logo seemed to trigger something in him, and the faintest smirk crept across his face, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, look at that," Bull said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "A politician in a place like this. You don't see that every day." The bikers chuckled, their laughter sharp and knowing. The other diners kept their heads down, except for a man at the counter, who muttered, "Here we go." Under his breath, J.D. looked up from his coffee, calm but alert. His gaze met Bull's without flinching. "Afternoon," he said evenly, his Ohio drawl carrying just enough weight to sound respectful but firm. "Afternoon," Bull repeated, drawing out the word as he leaned back in his chair. "Didn't think we'd see someone from Washington. All the way out here. Lost or just looking for votes?" The room fell silent. Even the waitress, who had been refilling a man's coffee, froze in place. "Neither," J.D. replied, setting his mug down and leaning slightly forward. "Just passing through, stopped in for the waffles. Heard they're good," Bull snorted. "Waffles, huh? That what they're calling campaign stops these days?" The bikers laughed again, but the sound was more subdued this time, as if they were gauging the mood. Bull's eyes narrowed, the smirk on his face hardening into something more confrontational. "You know," he said, gesturing vaguely at J.D.'s cap, "a hat like that sends a message. And out here, people read messages real clear." J.D. touched the brim of the cap lightly, as if he'd forgotten he was wearing it. He straightened in his seat, his expression neutral. "I know what it might look like," he said, his voice calm, "but sometimes a hat is just a hat." Bull pushed back his chair and stood, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. He took a step closer, his boots striking the tile with deliberate force. "And sometimes," he said, "it's a flag, a way of showing folks what side you're on." The tension in the room became almost unbearable. J.D. could feel every set of eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. Bull loomed over the booth now, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the table. J.D. didn't back down. Instead, he gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Why don't you sit down, and we can talk about what you think this hat says?" The unexpected invitation seemed to throw Bull off balance. For a moment, the room held its breath, and even the bikers exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, Bull crossed his arms and smirked again. "Talk, huh? That what you politicians do when you don't know what else to say?" "Sometimes," J.D. admitted, a hint of a smile breaking through. "But mostly I just listen." Bull tilted his head, studying J.D. as if trying to figure out his angle. After a long pause, he pulled out the chair and sat down, the leather of his jacket creaking as he leaned forward. "All right, Mr. Vice President," he said, his tone almost mocking. "Let's hear what you got to say." J.D. leaned back slightly, his hands resting lightly on the table. "It's not about what I've got to say," he replied. "It's about what you see when you look at this hat and what it says to you." Bull's eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to shrink around them. For the first time, the power in the exchange shifted slightly. The hostility in Bull's gaze softened, just a fraction, replaced by something more introspective. "You really want to know what it says to me?" Bull asked, his voice quieter but still edged with suspicion. "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't," J.D. said. Bull leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. It says you don't get it. People like you, politicians, big shots from the city, you show up out here with your fancy words and your plans, but you don't know what it's like. Not really. That hat, it's just another way of saying, you're not one of us. JD let the words hang in the air for a moment, nodding slightly, as if considering them carefully. I get why you'd feel that way, he said finally. But what if I told you I'm here to understand what it is like? Not to make speeches, not to tell you what to think, just to listen. Bull's brow furrowed, and for the first time, he didn't have a quick response. The silence that followed was heavy, but charged with possibility. The waitress, sensing the shift in mood, cautiously approached with JD's plate of waffles. She set it down without a word, her eyes darting nervously between him and Bull. "Thanks," JD said with a small smile. Then turning back to Bull, he added, "You hungry? They're as good as everyone says." Bull blinked, caught off guard by the simple, almost absurdly normal question. One of the bikers by the counter snickered, breaking the tension just enough to let the room breathe again. "We'll see," Bull muttered, his tone less biting than before. "But you'd better have more than waffles if you're serious about this conversation." JD chuckled softly, cutting into his food. "I think we can manage that." The diner was quieter now, the hum of conversation reduced to a low murmur as patrons pretended not to watch the unfolding exchange. Bull sat across from JD, his broad shoulders hunched slightly forward, arms crossed as if he were bracing himself. His crew lingered at the counter, sipping their coffee, but clearly tuned in. "So," Bull began, leaning on the edge of the table, "you said you're here to listen. Well, let me make it simple for you. People out here are tired of being talked at, tired of promises that don't mean a damn thing, and tired of people like you showing up just long enough to say you care before heading back to your cushy life." JD set his fork down, his expression thoughtful. "I get that," he said, "and you're not wrong to feel that way. A lot of folks in places like this have been overlooked, written off even. That's part of why I'm here, not to fix everything in one afternoon, but to hear from the people who live it every day." Bull raised an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. "Hearing's one thing, doing's another. You've got a title now. Power. So what are you doing with it?" JD met his gaze evenly. "I grew up in a town not so different from this one. Middletown, Ohio. Steel mills kept the lights on, and when those started closing, a lot of families, including mine, felt the weight of it. I know what it's like to wonder if the bills will get paid or if there's any point in hoping things will get better." Bull's expression hardened slightly. "And now? You're sitting pretty in D.C. While we're still out here, same as always." JD nodded. "That's fair," he admitted. "But the way I see it, the point of getting to where I am isn't to forget where I came from. It's to use that position to make things better. That's why I work on things like job training programs for rural communities and investments in small-town infrastructure. It's not enough, I know, but it's a start." Bull leaned back, a dry chuckle escaping his lips. "Job training, infrastructure, that's just fancy talk for spending money and hoping something sticks." "Maybe," JD replied, smiling faintly. "But you tell me, what would make a difference to you? What do you think people here need most?" Bull hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He glanced over his shoulder at his crew, then back at JD. "We need to know we're not just forgotten, that what we do still matters." JD leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "And what is it you do, Bull? What keeps you going?" Bull's jaw tightened, but his voice softened when he answered. "Mechanics. I fix things. Bikes. Mostly, sometimes cars. Been doing it since I was a kid. My old man taught me. It's not much, but it's honest." JD nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's more than honest. It's critical. People rely on folks like you to keep things running, and you've probably learned more about problem-solving in that shop than some folks ever will in a classroom." Bull's gaze shifted, his defenses lowering just a little. Maybe, he muttered. And that's the kind of work we need to support, JD continued, not just through words, but by creating opportunities that value the skills and grit it takes to keep things going in places like this. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't tense, though. It was contemplative, as if the words were settling in. One of Bull's crew, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, finally broke the quiet from the counter. "All right, Mr. Big Shot," he said, his voice sharp but curious. "You talk a good game, but why'd you really come here? Guys like you don't just wander into places like this for waffles." JD turned slightly to address him, his voice steady. "I came here to listen, to see things for myself. It's easy to make decisions from an office, but it's different when you're out here, hearing the stories and seeing the faces." The man with the scar snorted. "Listening? That's rich. You think you can fix the world with that?" "Not by itself," JD replied, "but it's a start, and it's a hell of a lot better than assuming I already have all the answers." Bull's lips twitched, as if he wanted to smile, but wasn't ready to give JD that victory. "You really think listening changes anything?" JD met his gaze, his tone firm. "I do. Because when we stop listening, we stop seeing each other as people. We just see enemies, stereotypes, or problems to solve. But when we listen, really listen, it gets harder to ignore what we have in common." The room fell quiet again, the weight of his words settling over the diners and the bikers alike. Even Bull seemed to soften, though his guard wasn't entirely down. "All right," Bull said after a moment, leaning back in his chair. "You want to listen? I'll give you something to hear, but you'd better have more than talk to back it up." JD nodded, his expression resolute. "Fair enough. How about this? Let me show you something that might change how you see what's possible." Bull tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "There's a facility not far from here," JD said. "A project I've been working on. It's about creating opportunities, not just in cities, but in places like this. If you're willing, I'd like you and your crew to come see it." The bikers exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. Bull turned back to JD, his expression unreadable. "You're serious?" he asked. "As a heart attack," JD replied. After a long pause, Bull shrugged. "All right, VP Vance, let's see what you've got." The group of bikers followed JD Vance out into the diner's parking lot, their boots crunching against the gravel as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows. JD's security detail lingered nearby, clearly uneasy, but keeping their distance. Parked off to the side was a government-issued SUV, its polished black exterior standing out against the backdrop of weathered pickup trucks and dusty sedans. "Everyone ride in your own bikes?" JD asked, gesturing to their motorcycles lined up neatly in a row. Bull crossed his arms. "We're not about to leave these behind. Where's this place you're talking about?" "About 10 minutes up the road," JD replied, sliding his hands into his pockets. "Will caravan. Shouldn't be a tight squeeze for you and your crew." Bull glanced back at his group, then gave a short nod. "All right, lead the way." The bikers mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring to life and breaking the stillness of the lot. JD climbed into the SUV, his chief of staff in the passenger seat, and they pulled out, the convoy weaving through the empty stretch of road. The sound of the motorcycles was thunderous, echoing off the surrounding hills. As they approached the facility, the landscape began to shift. The dusty plains gave way to a sleek, modern building that seemed almost out of place in its surroundings. Made of glass and steel, the structure glinted in the sunlight, its angular design hinting at innovation and progress. JD pulled into the parking lot and stepped out of the SUV, gesturing for the bikers to park nearby. They dismounted, their initial bravado replaced by a quiet wariness. The contrast between their worn leather jackets and the futuristic setting couldn't have been starker. "What is this place?" Bull asked, his tone cautious. It's a job training and innovation center, JD explained, leading them toward the entrance. We're working on equipping folks in rural areas with the skills they need for the jobs of the future. Technology, manufacturing, renewable energy, you name it. He swiped a keycard at the glass doors, which slid open with a soft whoosh. Inside, the air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the Texas heat outside. The hum of machinery filled the space, and employees moved with purpose among rows of workstations and equipment. Large screens displayed real-time metrics, project updates, and digital blueprints. The bikers hesitated at the threshold, their usual confidence shaken by the unfamiliar environment. It was the youngest of the group, a wiry man with a red bandana, who broke the silence. "This is wild," he muttered, his wide eyes fixed on a robotic arm assembling a complex component with surgical precision. JD smiled. "It's something, isn't it? Come on, let me show you around." As they walked through the facility, JD spoke with quiet enthusiasm, explaining each section in detail. He showed them the battery assembly line, where sleek modules were crafted to power electric vehicles and homes. He pointed out the solar panels undergoing stress tests, highlighting their potential to provide energy to off-grid communities. At one station, a team of engineers worked on a prototype for an affordable electric tractor designed for small-scale farmers. "This one's my favorite," JD said, gesturing to the streamlined machine. "It's not just about sustainability, it's about giving farmers the tools they need to compete in a changing economy." The bikers exchanged glances, their skepticism giving way to curiosity. Even Bull, who had remained silent for most of the tour, seemed to soften as he took in the scope of the work being done. "This ain't what I expected," Bull admitted finally, his gruff voice cutting through the hum of machinery. "What did you expect?" JD asked, glancing at him. Bull shrugged. "I don't know. A lot of talk, maybe some charts on a wall, not this." JD stopped walking and turned to face him. "That's the point," he said. "We're not just talking about change, we're building it. And we're doing it in places like this because the people here deserve to be part of the future, not left behind by it." Bull studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said finally. "But how does any of this help someone like me? Someone who's spent his whole life fixing what's broken, not building something new?" JD nodded, as if he'd been expecting the question. "It helps because it shows what's possible," he said. "It's easy to get stuck in the way. Things have always been. But when you see something like this, it opens your mind to what you could do. It's not about replacing what you know. It's about adding to it, expanding it." Bull's jaw tightened as he absorbed the words. The other bikers who had been milling around began to gather closer, their curiosity evident. "You really believe that?" Bull asked, his tone softer now. "I do," JD replied without hesitation, "because I've seen it happen. People who thought their best days were behind them are now leading teams, building their own businesses, and teaching others what they've learned. Change isn't easy, but it's possible, especially for folks who know the value of hard work." The group continued the tour, their earlier hostility replaced by a quiet awe. By the time they reached the end, the bikers' initial skepticism had given way to a mix of admiration and reflection. Even Bull, who had confronted JD so fiercely at the diner, seemed changed by what he'd seen. As they approached the exit, JD paused, turning to address the group. "Look, I'm not saying this place is the answer to everything," he said, "but it's a start. And if you ever want to see what else is out there, you're always welcome here." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Bull stepped forward, his expression serious but less guarded than before. "You're not what I expected, Vance," he said gruffly, "but I'll give you this. You've got my attention." "Fair enough," JD replied with a small smile. The ride back to the diner was quieter than the journey out. The silence hanging over the group like a thick fog. The roar of the motorcycles still filled the air, their engines echoing across the open road. But within the riders' minds there was a quiet stillness, a reflective pause that seemed to stretch endlessly as they processed what they'd just witnessed. The events of the past hours lingered in their thoughts, the weight of the encounter with the stranger still fresh in their minds. Bull led the convoy, his posture stiff, but not in the usual hardened way. There was a tension in his movements, a subtle shift that spoke of deeper thoughts at play. He gripped the handlebars a little more firmly than usual, his knuckles white beneath the worn leather gloves. JD, following behind in the SUV, couldn't help but glance at the bikers through the rearview mirror every so often. He wondered what was running through their minds, whether they were still mulling over the stranger's words, whether they felt any differently about their mission now, or if the weight of the day had started to sink in. The convoy moved like a procession, steady and unhurried, as if each rider had been lost in a private contemplation. The day was beginning to fade, and the long stretch of highway ahead seemed to hold endless possibilities for introspection. When they finally pulled into the dusty parking lot of the diner, the sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long, slanted shadows across the cracked asphalt. The golden light bathed the scene, giving everything an almost dreamlike quality. The usual hum of activity, the chatter of the diner's patrons, the clink of silverware seemed far away as the bikers dismounted one by one. Their movements were slower now, less energetic than when they had first set out. The bravado they had carried so confidently was tempered by something deeper, something more thoughtful. They paused, as if trying to make sense of the shift they'd just undergone, unsure of what to say or how to articulate the thoughts crowding their minds. JD stepped out of the SUV, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked toward the group. He leaned against the door, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his gaze flickering between the riders and the setting sun. He could feel the weight of the silence in the air, could almost taste it. He knew the inevitable conversation was coming, but for now he remained quiet, waiting for them to speak first. The group gathered in a loose circle near their bikes, the usual banter replaced by quiet murmurs. There was an unspoken respect between them, a shared understanding that today had been different. Something had changed. Bull remained at the edge of the circle, his eyes fixed on the horizon, not looking at anyone but instead searching for something. Perhaps the right words, or perhaps the right moment to break the silence. His jaw was clenched, his mind racing, as he tried to come to terms with everything that had just unfolded. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Bull shifted his gaze, turning to face JD. His expression was unreadable, his usual tough demeanor softened by a complexity JD hadn't seen before. The lines on his face were deeper than they had been earlier, his eyes clouded with thought. It wasn't just the weight of their mission anymore. There was something else, something human, rising to the surface. The words, when they came, were slow, deliberate, and carried the gravity of the journey they'd just shared. "You're a strange guy, Vance," Bull said, his voice gruff but lacking the hostility it had carried earlier. JD raised an eyebrow. "That so?" "Yeah," Bull continued, crossing his arms. "Most politicians don't bother coming out this far, and the ones who do, they're all talk. But you showed us something today. Gotta admit, it made me think." JD nodded, sensing the weight of the admission. "Thinking's a good start," he said. "It's what gets us to the next step." Bull chuckled dryly. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," JD replied, his tone serious. "But it's worth it. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without people who are willing to try, even when it feels impossible." One of the younger bikers, the man with the red bandana, spoke up. "That place, it's like something out of a movie. You really think all that tech stuff can fix things? Like for real? JD turned to him, his expression thoughtful. I think technology is a tool, he said, but tools are only as good as the people using them. What really matters is how we choose to use those tools, whether we build walls or bridges. The choice is always ours. The group fell into silence again, the weight of JD's words settling over them. Bull shifted his stance, his boots crunching against the gravel. You've got a lot of ideas, Vance, Bull said finally, and I don't know if I buy all of it. But I'll give you this, you've got guts coming out here and talking to us like this. Most folks wouldn't bother. That's because they don't see what I see, JD replied. People like you, people who know what it means to work hard, to keep things running when everything else feels like it's falling apart. You're the backbone of this country, and we can't afford to leave you behind. Bull nodded slowly, his tough exterior cracking just enough to reveal a flicker of understanding. He extended a hand. You're all right, Vance. We don't agree on everything, but I respect you for showing up and for listening. JD shook his hand firmly. And I respect you for telling me the truth. That's the hardest part, but it's where everything starts. The bikers exchanged glances, the tension that had hung over them earlier now replaced by a quiet camaraderie. They mounted their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life once again. One by one, they pulled out of the lot, leaving JD standing by his SUV, watching them go. Bull was the last to leave, giving JD a brief nod before revving his engine and disappearing down the road. As the dust settled, JD stood for a moment, staring out at the horizon. He thought about the day's events, the unexpected confrontation, the honest conversations and the glimmers of hope that had emerged from it all. It wasn't the kind of progress you could measure in headlines or polls, but it was real. And it reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place. Progress wasn't about sweeping gestures or grandiose plans. It was about moments like this, small, imperfect, but full of possibility. JD climbed into his SUV, the engine humming to life as he pulled out of the parking lot. The diner grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the lessons of the day stayed. With him, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, he felt a quiet resolve. Sometimes, all it took to bridge a divide was a conversation and a willingness to listen.